we're going to begin a new theme today, which will kind of bring us into the next few months of kind of what we're going to be focusing on during our Sunday services and all the teaching and preaching that happens over the next few weeks and months. And the theme is this: becoming mature. Become mature. We're going to be unpacking this huge topic over the next few weeks and months. But I like to begin with a question. The question is this: have you ever tried to do something that you consider to be impossible for you? I once climbed Ben Nevis in Scotland, which is the highest freestanding mountain in the UK. It was impossible for me, really, to be honest, but I did it. Hey, do you want to give me a round of applause? Oh. But I tried to do something recently which I consider to be impossible, and this impossible task is the following thing. I tried to watch cricket a few weeks ago. I tried, and I maybe it's kind of going to split the congregation a little bit because some of you might love cricket. Maybe we've got some cricket fans in the room. Well, I'm sorry to offend you, but I tried to watch your favorite sport, and I couldn't. It was impossible. It was like watching paint dry. It really was. I would prefer to watch a long game of chess, you know? It was just hard to engage with. There was like too much waiting around, you know? What's that about? Well, it was impossible for me to do. Well, I'm gonna try to do something impossible today, which is to preach an entire book in the New Testament called the Book of Hebrews. I'm gonna try to preach the whole thing in about 25 minutes. Now, obviously, we're not going to quote every single scripture and every single idea in this book, but I'm going to try to cover the big ideas in the book of Hebrews. Let's see whether we can do it or not. And if not, then we'll be here at about 2 o'clock. But we won't be. I'll be done. I promise you by then. We'll be done by 2 o'clock. That's the guarantee. But not only that, I'm actually going to do two impossible things today. The second impossible thing is I'm going to try to take on a colossal challenge that maybe all of us, to some degree, have come up against, and it's this impossible thing, this impossible-sized problem. I'm going to try to speak into it today. Why is it, this is the problem, why is it that someone can believe in Jesus for years, even decades, but not make much progress in their Christian development, in their maturity, in their character? Why is it that often we can trust Jesus, follow Jesus for years and decades, but not see the progress in our character in becoming more like Jesus? If only Christians could become more like Jesus, wouldn't things be so much better? And of course, we do have some Christians who become more like Jesus, and I'm pleased for that. And I'm pleased for that because you're kind, you're generous, and what have you. And we all have this challenge and sometimes discouragement in our journey, in our Christian journey, of why is it that I haven't seemingly overcome this problem? We're going to try to look at that today and take on that impossible challenge. So today I would like to speak for a few minutes on this topic: the miracle of maturity. The miracle of maturity. One of the gifts of being a parent is you get to relive your best childhood moments through your own child. Where, you know, that moment, for example, when Darth Vader says to his son, Luke, I am your father. Join me, and together we can rule the galaxy as father and son. That's just an amazing moment. It's like that revelation that Luke Skywalker's dad is Darth Vader. Like, if I've spoiled that for you, the film's been out since 1980. So, you know, come on, what are you doing with your time? And it's that moment I can see my 5-year-old boy, his eyes light up at the revelation of what just happened in The Empire Strikes Back. More recently, we've been watching some Disney films, some classics from the past. You know, Peter Pan. Been watching Peter Pan. And as you know, Peter Pan is a classic children's story about a magical boy, Peter, who never grows up. Famously, Peter Pan has the fear of growing up. He wants to live in a perpetual childhood. He wants to cling on to that moment of childhood. Interestingly, I learned and discovered recently that there's a syndrome called Peter Pan syndrome, Peter Pan condition, PPS. It's not a official medical diagnosis, but it's a theory, it's a psychological condition theory that recognizes the problem within adults that want to hold on to their childhood far too much. Maybe I've got a little bit of PPS when it comes to Star Wars. I want to hold on. I'm not giving that up. I'm not giving that story up. But not only is Peter Pan syndrome a problem in some adults like myself, it's also a problem running rampant in the church at large. See, the New Testament vision is for every Christian to become spiritually mature. Now, we're going to explore this in a much more layered and deeper way over the next few weeks and months. But we can look at what Paul says to the church in Ephesus, modern-day Turkey, when he clarified the role of people like me, pastors and teachers, the role of church leaders. He said this in Ephesians 4, verse 12 to 14. The role of people like myself, church leaders, etc., is to equip the saints for works of ministry. So it's not for me to do all the work. It's for us as a church to facilitate your development so that you can be equipped to be everything God's called you to be. To equip the saints, Paul says, for works of ministry, for building up of the body until we all attain, not just some of us, but all attain the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood. You could say womanhood as well. But for the sake of time, Paul is just writing manhood. He hasn't got the time. He's in prison. He's doing stuff. He's on the move all the time. To the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. The maturity. You see the maturity all the way through this passage. So verse 14, so that we may no longer be tossed to and fro like children by the waves and carried about by the wind of every doctrine. Doctrine is just a set of teaching. By human cunning, by craftiness and deceitful schemes. So it's my heart as a pastor, you could say, to create an environment that facilitates the development of maturity for every person who's part of City Life Church. But I'm well aware that I'm not really equipped or up to the job to do that myself. In fact, our leadership team, our leadership community, we can't do this with just clever strategy. We can't see our church move into maturity, or you move into maturity just by clever strategies, clever programs, great questions at connect groups or what have you. It's going to take a move of the Spirit of God to move us on the inside to become a bigger person. I'm grateful for the times God moved in that area of provision. I'm grateful, and we're grateful for how God protects us and how God helps us in our circumstances. But what I need most, and maybe what we all need most, is not just for God to move around me, for God to move around us and be involved in our lives in some external measurement way. But what we need more than anything else is for God to work within us, for God to work within me. I need a move of God, in other words, in the area of my maturity. See, maturity has very little to do with age. I'm thankful for the silver foxes in the City Life Church. That's a great word, isn't it? I think we should rename our older connect groups silver fox groups. But maturity has very little to do with age and everything to do with the condition of our hearts. The church needs more than ever before, maybe, to experience the miracle of maturity, the miracle of maturing. This is why we're taking a bit of a swan dive, a deep dive into the book of Hebrews for a moment, because some Bible teachers have referred to the book of Hebrews as the book about Christian maturity. So let's briefly look at some basics about the book of Hebrews first. Number three interesting facts. Some of you might not find it very interesting, but 3 interesting facts. Number 1, the author of the book of Hebrews, the human author, notice how the human author, there's a divine author, the Holy Spirit, but the human author is unknown. Some early church fathers thought, in fact, most Christians up until the 15th century believed it was Paul that wrote Hebrews, but we just don't know. It certainly sounds a little bit like Paul, but it also could be Apollos. It could be a few different people. Barnabas is one theory, but I won't bore you with all the theories because who really cares? But the human author is unknown. Secondly, it's more like a sermon than a letter. It's like he's preaching to a church. That's how it's written, and that kind of frames a little bit about how Hebrews is quite unique in how it sounds and feels and reads. Thirdly, Hebrews is addressed to Jewish Christians, that's important, living in severe persecution. So that's what Hebrews is about. That's why it's called the letter to the Hebrews. Hebrews is that term for kind of God's Old Testament people, the Jews. And Messianic Jews, those who have a Jewish ethnicity but have embraced the lordship of Jesus, embraced the gospel, they become Messianic Jews, Bible-believing, gospel-believing Christians, but they still have their Jewish identity. But that's the context. That's who I was going to say Paul is addressing. That's who the unknown human author is addressing, the writer of Hebrews is addressing, and that just helps helps us to frame a little bit about what Hebrews is actually addressing. It was probably written between 60 to 70 AD before the fall of the Jewish temple. A key verse which we're going to look at now is Hebrews 5 verses 11 to chapter 6 verse 1. So we're going to look at Hebrews 5 verse 12 for a few verses, and we'll then take it from there. It says this: "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic principles of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. For everyone who lives on milk or lattes is unskilled in the word of righteousness." Give me espresso. Give me the hard stuff, not just lattes. Hebrews. God loves coffee. Hebrews. It's so bad, isn't it? It's so bad. Everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, since he is a child. But solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. Then the next verse, which goes into chapter 6, but remember that the chapters and the verses weren't there until more recently, so it was just kind of one flow of a sermon message. Therefore, verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 6, "Therefore let us leave the elementary doctrine of Christ and go on to maturity." The renowned New Testament scholar Tom Wright said, "Some Christians are indeed eager and ready for solid food, but I deeply regret," Tom writes, "in many churches in Western Europe at least, it seems that the most people can be persuaded to take on board is another small helping of milk." I almost did an illustration today, but I didn't, because I was thinking, how am I going to do it in a way which doesn't put somebody in an uncomfortable position? Because I was almost going to buy some baby food and feed one of you some baby food while I eat steak. I was going to get some steak for me and some baby food for you. But I didn't do that. But you can get the gist. We all know what baby food looks like. Think of Carrot Crush. Our son, when he was starting to eat, the first thing we fed him was Carrot Crush, and he was disgusted. Because Carrot Crush is not the sweetest thing to taste. And that transition from milk as a baby to Carrot Crush can be a hard transition to make for many, many babies. And the writer of Hebrews is disheartened to see the lack of growth in people's character. They should be a lot further down the journey of their maturity, but they're stunted in their growth, and they can't move on from into the next level of what God has for them and who God's called them to be. And they're stunted because they're stuck on Carrot Crush, spiritually speaking. And the writer of Hebrews clearly implies that within quite a short period, a disciple, a believer, ought to grow up into the stage where they are beginning to take responsibility for other people's spiritual development too. In other words, disciples are meant to make disciples. But we have this Peter Pan syndrome that was in the first century Hebrew church, and it's also in our Western church as well, as Tom Wright talks about in his quote. So over the next few moments, I want to condense the entire book of Hebrews into 3 words. And the 3 words are the following. This is really what the writer of Hebrews is trying to articulate and helping the Christians to move toward a better place of development and maturity. These are the 3 words. Jesus is better. Jesus is better. If I was to be more in line with the type of language that the writer of Hebrews would use, it would be this: Jesus is superior. The writer of Hebrews, in order to help these believers away and get out of arrested development and move out of PPS, Peter Pan syndrome, he tries to get this young church to see the superiority of Jesus as it compares to the other cultures and other ideas in the world back then. See, there's all sorts of competing ideas where we, even in the 21st century culture, that wage war against the truth that Jesus is better, that Jesus is superior. You see, what empowers and animates the Christian maturity more than any other thing is the firm belief that Jesus is better than fill in the blank. Jesus is better than Carrot Crush. Jesus is better than fill in the blank. Whatever our culture, whatever our friends, whatever our family are telling us about what is better or superior, it's not true. Jesus is better than fill in the blank. See, the pressing question at the heart of the book of Hebrews is the writer frustrated, asking this question: how can these Christians turn their back away from the gospel, away from the superiority of Jesus, and go back to their former ways of life? He was hearing stories, rumors, gossip maybe, about how the believers in this location were tempted to go back to live the kind of life they were living before. But the writer of Hebrews is saying, no. Jesus is better than whatever you find elsewhere. He's better than whatever you find on the internet. He's better than whatever you find in other religions and other paganism. He's better than any form of spirituality or even the heights of materialism. Jesus is better. Jesus is superior. Jesus is the one who can truly satisfy us more than any other person or any other thing. Jesus is better. And as we fasten our seatbelts and over the next few moments fly 40,000 feet above the letter of Hebrews, you ready? It's going to be a bit of turbulence. There's no food apart from the Lord's Supper at the end. There's no kind of like flight snacks or anything. But we're going to fly a little bit over quite fast over the book of Hebrews, and we're going to see a bit of the overview. This is the main structure of Hebrews. It's going to be on the screen. Chapters 1 to 4 is talking about the superiority of Jesus in a specific way, that Jesus is better than the angels. He's better than Moses and the law and the prophets. He's come to fulfill the requirements of the law, as we touched on last week. Then Hebrews 4 to 10, these are the chapters, by the way. Jesus is at the priestly office and work, talks about how Jesus fulfilled the Mosaic law, the Old Testament law of Moses. And then the final parts is kind of encouragement to draw near to God, to hold fast and to persevere, believe, and love in the midst of challenging times. You enjoyed your flight. It was a good flight, wasn't it? And I'm going to just, for a few moments, turn these big chunk sections into 3 palatable points that will help us to see how we can grow in our Christian development. The first thing is this: Jesus is unique. Jesus is unique. This is chapters 1 to 4, where the writer of Hebrews is clearly writing about how Jesus is the unique Son of God. He's better than the angels. Hebrews 1, verses 1 to 2 says, long ago, in a galaxy far, far away, long ago, at many times in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir to all things, through whom also he created the world. Profound statement to make. Jesus, in other words, is not just a A-list prophet. He's not just a godly man or a great inspiring philosopher. Jesus, according to this verse is underlining, emphasizing, and it can't get any clearer, that he's emphasizing the divinity of Christ by stating that he's the Son of God. But not only that it was through Jesus that the world was created. That Jesus didn't just exist at the moment of the incarnation, didn't just exist when he was laid in a manger at Christmas, but he existed way, way before then. The Bible teaches that Jesus was not created, but rather he is the creator. I don't normally say creator like that. I say creator. I'm a Sunderland. But someone here is going to be really posh and say creator. So I thought I would try to speak to all people in the room. Hebrews 1, 3 to 4, just continuing the passage, it says, he is, speaking of Jesus, the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. He upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making the purifications for sins, he sat down at the right hand of majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name that he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Jesus is better. Jesus is the unique, uncreated, eternal Son of God. Jesus is the radiance and glory of God, and he's the exact imprint of his nature who made the purifications for our sins. The Bible teaches that before creation was, Christ was. As early as Christian confession was developed into creeds like the Apostle Creed, the Nicene Creed. And in that time, the earliest Christian confessions confessed the divinity of Jesus, that he is not created, he is the creator. Secondly, the second thing that Hebrews puts across to us is Jesus succeeded where we failed. Chapters 4 to 10 tell us that Jesus has fulfilled the old covenant sacrificial system, and Jesus, therefore, is better than Moses and better than the Old Testament law. Hebrews 4, verses 14 to 16. Since then, we have a great high priest who's passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Jesus succeeded where we failed. He was tempted as we are. And because of that, in the humanity of Jesus, he can empathize with our weaknesses. Don't you love that thought? That there's not just God on high somewhere thinking grand thoughts from a distance on a cloud eating Philadelphia cheese, but he's right with us in our humanity. It doesn't squash or limit his divinity, but he's with us in our humanity. He can empathize and sympathize with our moments of temptation, moments of hindrance, moments of weakness, moments of doubt. God understands our weaknesses. God understands our humanity, but yet he did not sin. He was tempted, he was tested, but he didn't sin. I went to a doctor one day to get my toenail pulled out. Here's a picture. And I had an ingrown toenail. Maybe I incorrectly cut my toenail one day. How hard is it to cut your toenail straight? I messed up. And savagely kind of cut my toenail in a clumsy way, and 6 months down the line, like, it needed to be pulled out. Thankfully, the doctor had done it before. It wasn't the first time pulling out a toenail. I kind of wanted to check. I was only 14 at the time, but I wanted to check. Have you pulled out a toenail before? If this is your first time, this is not going to be my first time. I'm going to be out the door. But I was assured that this doctor had studied and went through the test of pulling out toenails before. He went to university for 7 years to become a doctor of pulling out toenails. And because of that, because he was tested, I could trust him. I could trust his experience because he'd done it before. In the same way, we can trust Jesus because he's been through exactly what we've been through and even worse, but yet he didn't fail. Jesus succeeded where we failed. He passed the test. The test that we failed, he passed it. But it gets better. Jesus succeeded where we failed. But here's where the news about Jesus' sacrifice becomes good news for us. In Hebrews 5, verses 7 to 9, it says, in the days of his flesh, speaking about obviously the earthly life of Jesus, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears. Again, lots in these verses to unpack, but we haven't got the time. This is an overview. This is a 40,000-foot flyover. To him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. There's, again, a word in there in the Greek that we could explore, but I'll leave that for another day. Verse 8, although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, that doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't perfect before. Again, this is talking about the human side of his life and how he is identifying with humanity as the Son of Man, who then lived the life that we could not, even though he was perfect before coming in the flesh. He went through the testing of what we go through in order to be the one who passes the test, the only human to not sin, in order to become a sacrifice. And this is what it then goes on to say in verse 9, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. What does that obey mean? To believe him. To trust him, not to do, but to believe. That doesn't mean that Christianity doesn't become a set of things that we ought to do, but that's not where Christianity begins. The gospel begins not with he is a list of things to do, but he is a person to trust and obey, and his name is Jesus. So Jesus became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, all who trust him, all who admit that they failed the test, but Jesus passed the test. And you know what this means? It means that we get the credit for Jesus' holy life. We get the credit for Jesus' perfect exam score. This is what theologians call the imputed righteousness of Christ, where when God looks at us through the cross, he doesn't see our sin, he sees a forgiven son and daughter. Jesus succeeded where we failed. We get the credit. It's incredible. We get the credit for Jesus' righteousness. Jesus pleased God for us. We couldn't please God in ourselves, but Jesus came to please God for us. Jesus becomes the source of our salvation. Jesus is better. Again, the Hebrews were looking to go back to the Mosaic law. They were looking to go back to the past and look at Moses and Elisha and the prophets. All that is great, and we still acknowledge the Old Testament as the written word, inspired word of God. But they were looking to try to use animal sacrifices to wash away their sins. That's what their life was before meeting Jesus. But the writer of Hebrews is saying animal sacrifices can't do away with sin. Only the blood of a perfect sacrifice can erase our sin. And that perfect sacrifice can be found in one person, Jesus. Jesus succeeded where we failed. Jesus is better. Jesus is unique. Thirdly, the final part of the letter to the Hebrews can be summed up in point 3. Jesus opens up a new and living way for us. This is chapters 10 to 13. In Hebrews 10, verse 19, it says this, therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened up for us through the curtain. That's an Old Testament reference to do with the Holy of Holies in the temple. We haven't got time to really go into all of that, but through his flesh, it goes on, verse 21, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, referring to Jesus again, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled. Again, an Old Testament reference. This is not now literally our hearts being sprinkled, but obviously as it applies to the gospel and our trust, our hearts are sprinkled clean from evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Then it says in verse 23, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. So many of the Hebrew Christians were tempted to move away from the gospel, away from Jesus, and go back to their old life. They were pulled back into their former life. But the writer of Hebrews is exhorting them, encouraging them, and through that, encouraging us as well. He's saying, guys, plant yourself fully and exclusively into Christ and Christ alone, because only he can satisfy. He's saying, bury your hopes, your dreams, your goals, your life, your desires into Christ and in him alone. Nothing else will do. Nothing else will fulfill. Nothing else will bring you the hope you're craving for, the peace you're craving for. Jesus opens up a new and living way where we can experience the love of God in a way which is impossible without what Jesus has done. And then the writer of Hebrews then begins to give some practical encouragements and an application in verses 24 to 25 of Hebrews chapter 10. He says this, and let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together. Now, this is one of my favorite verses, obviously as a pastor, because it's telling us to come together. As John Lennon said, come together right now. The other words in that song don't apply, but not neglecting to meet together as some in the habit of doing. Wouldn't it be great if the writer of Hebrews just began to call out names like Charlie? I've seen you. You're not in the service this week, Charlie. I can see it. Our database tells us you haven't been to church for 6 weeks. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't name and shame anybody. But he says, just don't neglect meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day draw near. What day? Jesus is coming back. Again, that's a huge topic for another time, but Jesus is coming back soon. And as we see that day approaching, let's get stronger in our faith, not weaker. And if you feel like wavering, if you feel like tapping out, get together, come together right now. Because here's the reality. The new and living way that Jesus opened up for us is not a solo hobby. It's communal and corporate just as much as individual. Salvation, our life in Jesus, is individual, yes, but it's just as communal as it is individual. Here's the reality. You can't become spiritually mature just by reading the Bible on your own. We don't become mature in a vacuum of individualism. It's going to happen when we come together. And in the furnace of fellowship and coming together, we get irritated. And those things inside of us get evoked. You know, when you spend some time with God amongst the trees don't wind you up. The trees don't expose our insecurities and vulnerabilities and weaknesses and irritabilities. But when we get together with other people who are unlike us in temperament and personality, they don't laugh at the jokes that you think are really funny. It's like you're offended, and because you're offended, you feel like getting by yourself, because again, the trees don't offend you. But it's in that, it's in fellowship, it's in community, it's in church, it's in the corporate setting where the chips of Christian character begin to get shaped and sculpted, because it's coming together. But there's something that the writer of Hebrews is actually saying, as well as that, about why it's important to not neglect gathering together. And it's the fact that God is with us corporately in a way that He is not with us individually. He's with us corporately in a time like this where He's not with us individually. Now, He's with us individually, but He's with us in a unique, special way when we come together corporately. When 2 or 3 gather in my name, I am there. Now, Jesus is there when it's only one of you, but He's there in a special way when there's more than one of us there. Think about it. The Hebrew Christians were facing persecution. And in that persecution, it would be dangerous to show up in church on Sunday. But still, the writer of Hebrews is saying, I want you to come together because there's something more at risk than your life and safety involved here. It's your maturity. It's you going on with God and not giving up and flagging, quitting on the faith. That's more important than safety. Now, we don't have that demand amongst us today. I'm thankful we live in a time where we can come together like this and we can worship in freedom. The Prime Minister's not going to be sending the wolves out today. Maybe it's next week he might, but not today. So we even more underlines the important, essential necessity of coming together in times like this. Not just this, but also small groups and other things along church life as well. An inconvenient truth that some Christians like to dismiss is this, that the measure of your love for Jesus is evidenced in your love for Jesus' church. That's not just loving the services, but loving the people. And that's tested and tried when community is imperfect and people are imperfect, which is all the time. But He's saying, I want you to come together. Don't neglect coming together. But then the writer of Hebrews keeps bringing us back to the main thing, which is bringing us back to Jesus. In Hebrews 12, verses 1 to 2, it says, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. How do we experience the miracle of maturity? If there's one thing the Hebrews writer teaches us about maturity, it would be this. Make Jesus your vision. Behold Him, worship Him, look to Him. Charles Spurgeon said, a vision of God is the end of personal boasting. I think the key, you could say, that unlocks the miracle of maturing is Hebrews 12, verse 2, where it says, looking unto Jesus. Maturity doesn't happen by trying harder, by squeezing harder, by pushing harder. That's called constipation. Maturity doesn't happen by trying harder. Maturity is the byproduct of looking to Jesus. Do you want to grow in your faith? I imagine the hypothetical answer back would be yes. The more we look to Jesus, the more mature we will become. The prerequisite for becoming is beholden. The prerequisite of maturity is marveling, looking at Jesus. Maturity comes, change comes, transformation comes only through experiencing a greater thrill than sin. The lure of sin and the world in general will grow strangely dim as we behold the beauty and majesty of Jesus. The beauty of God seen in Jesus dying for us, laying down His life for us, taking upon Himself the gruesome burden of our sin. He did it for us. That is the beauty, the goodness of God seen in the sacrifice of Jesus. And looking unto Jesus, the writer of Hebrews leaves the church with. Looking unto Jesus. Look to Him. Trust in Him. I'm my most mature self when I'm looking at myself less. I'm more my mature self when I'm looking at Jesus more. In fact, when sin increases in our lives, it's because we're not looking at Jesus as frequently as we can. Because of the cross, we all have something to look forward to, the face of Jesus. And in the meantime, before we see Jesus with our own eyes, Jesus has given us a meal to feast on. This meal, known as communion, the Lord's Supper, helps us to remember the source of our salvation.